Welcome to Oldmere, where history slows down and peaceful sleep begins. Tonight, we are going somewhere with very thick walls. Picture a hill in the north of England, worn smooth by centuries of wind. It is late autumn, in the middle years of the 1300s. The light is fading early, the way it always does at this time of year, turning the sky the color of a dying ember. Below the hill, a river moves slowly through fields already touched by frost. And rising above all of it, gray stone against a graying sky, stands a castle. From a distance, a castle looks like a single solid thing, a fortress, a symbol, something built only for war and for standing guard against it. But that is only what a castle looks like from the outside. Step through the gatehouse, past the guards who have long since stopped truly watching for danger and mostly watch for the cold, and something changes. The castle stops being a fortress and becomes something else entirely, a small, self-contained world. There are kitchens here, and bakehouses, and stables warm with the breath of horses. There are gardens tucked into corners of the wall. There is laughter in some rooms and prayer in others, sometimes only a few footsteps apart. Hundreds of people might live and work inside these walls, and only a handful of them will ever swing a sword in anger. This is the world we are entering tonight, not the castle of banners and battles, but the castle of ordinary mornings, of bread rising in warm ovens, of horses being shod, of children underfoot in corridors too big for them, of a family trying, like every family, to get through the day. We are going to follow one such family. They did not leave their names in any chronicle. No historian will ever write a book about them alone. But families very much like theirs are the reason a castle like this could function at all, not the lord who owned it, not the knights who occasionally rode out from it, but the dozens of quiet hands that kept it fed, warm, and standing. Let the fire in your own room settle a little lower now, if you have one. Let your eyes rest. We begin, as most days in a castle begin, before the sun has fully risen, with a boy named Tom, lying very still in the dark, listening to his father get dressed. The room is small, and it is shared. This is not unusual. Almost every room in the castle is shared with someone, and privacy, as we understand it now, barely exists as an idea at all. Tom is 10 years old. He sleeps on a straw-filled mattress along one wall of a narrow chamber built into the thickness of the castle's outer wall, close to the smithy where his father works. His sister Elin, 7, sleeps curled against their mother on the other side of the room, beneath a blanket woven from rough wool that still, faintly, smells of the sheep it came from. Their father, Edmund, is already awake. Tom hears him before he sees him, the soft scrape of a boot being pulled on, the quiet clink of a leather strap being buckled. Edmund is a farrier, one of the castle's smiths, and his hands have been shaped by 20 years of hot iron and cold mornings. He does not light a candle. Candles are costly, and the gray light beginning to creep through the narrow window slit is, to eyes long used to darkness, almost enough. Somewhere above them, a bell begins to ring, slow and steady. It is not an alarm. It is simply the castle telling everyone inside it that the day has officially begun. This is one of the quieter truths about castle life that often gets lost in the noise of banners and battle stories. A castle ran on rhythm, not chaos. Meals, prayers, gate openings, changing of the guard, the ringing of bells to mark the canonical hours of the church day, all of it repeated, day after day, season after season, with a steadiness that most of its inhabitants had known since birth and would know until death. For a boy like Tom, the sound of that bell was as familiar and unremarkable as his own heartbeat. He sits up slowly, careful not to wake Elin, and pulls a rough woolen tunic over his head. The stone floor is cold enough to make him wince, even through the thin leather of his shoes. Somewhere below in the courtyard, he can already hear the first sounds of the household stirring a bucket, scraping against a well's stone rim, a dog barking once, and then falling silent, the low murmur of two servants exchanging some early complaint about the weather. Edmund pauses at the door and looks back at his son. "Come see the horses fed before you're wanted in the hall," he says. It is not really a question. Tom nods and follows him out. The corridor outside their room is narrow and unlit, carved through stone that has held the day's warmth so poorly that it feels, this time of morning, colder than the air outside. They pass a chapel doorway where a single candle burns for the priest already at his prayers, and a storeroom where sacks of grain lean against each other like sleeping giants. The castle, Tom has come to understand without ever being told directly, is built almost entirely of small rooms, serving small purposes, a place for everything, and more importantly, someone responsible for every place. Outside, the bailey, the open courtyard within the castle walls, is coming awake in pieces. A groom leads two horses toward the stable trough, their breath rising in pale clouds. A woman crosses toward the well with an empty bucket swinging from each hand. Smoke is beginning to rise, thin and gray, from the chimney above the kitchens, and with it comes the very first suggestion of wood smoke and warm bread, a smell that will grow stronger through the morning and will, eventually, seem to reach every corner of the castle, no matter how far from the ovens. It's easy, looking at old pictures of castles, to imagine them as cold and empty places, built only of stone and shadow. But a castle at dawn was one of the busiest small towns you could ever step into, because, in every sense that mattered, that is exactly what it was. Blacksmiths, bakers, laundresses, grooms, gardeners, chaplains, scribes, and dozens of servants whose entire job was simply keeping one small part of the household running smoothly. Most of them would never once set foot in the great hall unless summoned. Most of them, in fact, spent their whole lives within sight of the same four walls. Tom follows his father across the frost-touched cobbles toward the stables, past a low wall where a pair of hens have already begun scratching at the dirt in search of something worth eating. The stable itself is warm compared to the yard, thick with the smell of hay and horse and old leather, and the animals shift and stamp gently as father and son enter. Careful of Brannock, Edmund murmurs, nodding toward a large gray horse near the back. He's in a mood this morning. Tom keeps a respectful distance and instead helps scatter feed to the smaller ponies near the door, the ones used mostly for carrying messages or accompanying the Lord's wife on short rides beyond the walls. It is simple work, the kind he has done since he was old enough to carry a bucket without spilling it, but there is something steadying in its repetition. Feed the horses, check the water. Listen to his father hum, low and tuneless, the way he always does when his hands are busy and his mind is somewhere quieter. Outside, the bell rings again, a different pattern this time, calling the household toward morning prayer. Tom and his father will not attend. Not everyone can. Not with animals to feed and fires to keep lit. But somewhere across the bailey, his mother Alice is already rising too, already pulling on the apron that marks her as one of the kitchen's undercooks, already thinking about the long list of tasks that will fill her day before the sun goes down again. We will follow her there next into the warm, crowded, endlessly busy world of the castle kitchens, where an entire household's appetite had to be satisfied, one fire and one pot at a time. If the stables belonged to Edmund and the corridors belonged to Tom, the kitchens belonged almost entirely to Alice. She had worked there since she was younger than Elin, first as a girl fetching water and turning spits, later as someone trusted to season a broth or judge. By smell alone, whether bread had finished baking. Now, at 30, she moved through the kitchen the way Edmund moved through the stable, without needing to think about where anything was, because her hands had learned the space long before her mind had to. The kitchen itself sat apart from the main hall, connected by a covered walkway, a deliberate choice, since a stray spark in a kitchen this size could easily undo months of careful stonework elsewhere. Inside, the heat hit you immediately, a thick wall of warmth built from two enormous hearths, each large enough to roast a whole animal on an iron spit. Smoke curled toward blackened rafters overhead, where hooks held strings of onions, bundles of drying herbs, and the occasional side of bacon curing slowly in the warm air. By the time Ailey's arrived, the ovens were already glowing, tended through the night by a boy whose sole job in the coldest months was to make sure the fire never fully died. Bread could not wait for a fire to be relit from nothing. The whole rhythm of the kitchen depended on that fire holding steady, hour after hour, day after day. There is a quiet detail here worth sitting with for a moment. We tend to imagine the lord of a castle as the person who mattered most inside it, and in matters of land and law, he certainly did. But in the very practical matter of whether 200 people ate a decent meal that day, the person who mattered most was very often a cook like Alice, working under the head cook, whose name history rarely bothered to record at all. Alice's morning began with porridge oats simmered slowly in a great iron pot, enough to feed the household's lower servants before the more elaborate cooking of the day began. Bread came next, dozens of loaves at a time, the smell of it filling the covered walkway, and drifting, faintly, all the way to the stables, where Tom would catch a hint of it and feel his stomach remind him he hadn't eaten yet. By mid-morning, the kitchen had become something closer to organized chaos. A boy plucked feathers from a brace of geese near the door. 2 women stood at a long table, hands moving quickly, chopping vegetables pulled that same week from the castle's own garden onions, leeks, cabbage, whatever the season allowed. Someone else tended a pot of pottage, the thick vegetable stew that formed the backbone of most meals for most people in the castle, lord and servant alike, though what went into the lord's bowl was often considerably richer than what went into everyone else's. It's worth pausing gently here, not to lecture, but simply to notice something. A castle's kitchen fed everyone according to their place. The Lord's table might see roasted meats, spiced sauces, wine brought in at real expense. The servants ate simpler food bread, pottage, cheese, ale brewed within the castle walls itself, since water was often not trusted to be safe on its own. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was simply how the world worked, understood by nearly everyone inside those walls as unremarkable as the weather. Ailese did not resent this the way we might expect. Her hours were long, and her hands often burned or blistered, but there was pride in her work too, in a loaf that rose exactly right, in a broth that drew a nod of approval from the head cook, in knowing that whatever she carried to that hall would be, in its own small way, remembered. Even lords, she liked to say, forgot everything about a feast, except whether the food was good. By early afternoon, the great hall itself would fill with sound, not the roar of celebration you might picture from a story, but the steadier hum of daily life. This was where the household ate its main meal, where minor disputes were sometimes settled, where a traveling messenger might wait to be received, where, on quieter days, children like Elin were sometimes allowed to sit near the enormous hearth and watch the adults move about their business. Elin loved the hall for one reason above all others: the dogs. 2 or 3 hounds always seemed to be lying somewhere near the fire, waiting, with great patience, for scraps that fell from the long wooden tables. She would sit cross-legged beside them, running her small fingers through rough fur, half listening to the murmur of conversation drifting from the high table where the Lord and his family took their meals on a raised platform, set apart just enough to remind everyone, without a word needing to be said, who the hall ultimately belonged to. Tapestries hung along the stone walls, not merely for beauty, but for warmth. Thick cloth helped hold in heat that the enormous room, for all its grandeur, struggled constantly to keep. Even in the height of day, a faint chill lingered in the corners furthest from the fire, and servants moved briskly, as much to stay warm as to stay busy. As afternoon light angled low through the hall's narrow windows, Ailese would finally allow herself a brief pause, a cup of watered ale, a heel of bread taken quietly near the kitchen door, a moment to simply breathe before the evening meal preparations began all over again. It was, in many ways, the same shape every single day took. And there was a kind of comfort in that. A castle did not run on excitement. It ran on repetition, on people who understood their small part and returned to it faithfully morning after morning for most of their lives. Outside, the light was already beginning to soften toward evening. Smoke rose steadily from the kitchen chimney, curling upward into a sky just beginning to turn the color of embers. Somewhere in the stables, Edmund was likely finishing with the last of the horses. Somewhere near the hall's great hearth, Elin was probably still sitting with the dogs, warm and half-drowsy in the firelight. And somewhere, in a life none of them thought remarkable at all, a whole castle continued turning quietly around them, one fire, one loaf, one horseshoe at a time. The last of the daylight fades from the high windows of the hall. One by one, candles are lit against the coming dark, small points of warm light scattered through a vast stone room. For now, we leave the family here, gathered in the glow of the hearth, the day's work finally behind them. By the time the bell rang for evening prayer, Elin had fallen half asleep against the warm flank of one of the hall's hounds, her small hand still resting on its back. It was her mother who found her there, crouching down with a tired smile to gently shake her shoulder. "Come, love, chapel first, then supper." Elin blinked up, momentarily unsure of where she was, then remembered, and pushed herself upright with the particular reluctance of a child who has just found the perfect warm spot and is being asked to leave it. The castle's chapel sat near the chapel tower, a small stone room that felt, after the busy sprawl of the hall and kitchens, almost startlingly quiet. A handful of candles burned near the altar, their light catching on a single painted image of a saint watching serenely over the room. The priest, an older man named Father Hugh, who had served the household longer than Alis had been alive, stood waiting as the family and a scattering of other servants filed in. This was, for most people inside the castle walls, one of the few moments of the day that truly did not depend on rank. The Lord's family sometimes attended a private mass elsewhere, within the keep, but evensong in the smaller chapel belonged mostly to the household's working heart cooks, grooms, laundresses, smiths, their children tucked in beside them. For a few quiet minutes, everyone in that room was simply a person, tired from the day, glad of the warmth of candlelight and the low, familiar rhythm of prayer. Tom found he rarely listened closely to the Latin words themselves. He had heard them too many times to follow each one, but he liked the sound of them all the same. The way voices rose and fell together, steady as the tide. Beside him, Edmund's eyes were closed, his rough hands folded, some of the day's tension finally easing from his shoulders. Ailey's, standing near the back with flour, still faintly dusted along one sleeve, simply let herself breathe. Faith, in a household like this, was not treated as a separate part of life set apart from the rest of it. It was woven directly through the day, a blessing murmured before meals, a small cross traced before difficult tasks. The turning of each day around the same handful of prayers that had shaped the hours since before anyone currently standing in that chapel had been born. It asked very little in the way of grand gestures. Mostly, it simply asked people to pause. When the short service ended, the family stepped back out into a courtyard, now fully given over to dusk. Torches had been lit along the walls nearest the hall, their flames bending gently in the evening air, and the smell of wood smoke had thickened, mingling now with something richer, drifting from the kitchen, the evening meal, nearly ready. They ate that night much as they ate most nights, a simple pottage thick with barley and whatever vegetables the season allowed, a heel of bread each, a small portion of cheese shared between the children. It was not a grand meal, but it was warm, and it was enough, and there was something quietly precious in the four of them sitting together at one of the long benches near the edge of the hall, close enough to the fire to feel its heat on their faces. Elin, reviving now that food was in front of her, chattered about the dogs, about a kitchen cat she'd spotted, stalking something along the rafters, about a boy who'd nearly dropped an entire tray of bread that morning. Tom mostly listened, occasionally correcting some small detail of her story with the quiet authority of an older brother, while Edmund ate slowly, content simply to have his family close after a day spent mostly apart from them. It's a small thing, perhaps, to picture a family eating supper together after a long day of work. But it is worth remembering that this not the grandeur of the hall, not the banners overhead, not even the fire itself was very often the actual center of a life like theirs. The castle gave them purpose and shelter, but this small circle of warmth at the end of a shared table, was what made the day feel, in the end, worth having lived. As the meal wound down and the younger servants began clearing bowls and benches, the hall slowly emptied around them. Outside, full dark had settled over the bailey, and with it came a different castle, entirely one Tom had always found faintly thrilling, though he could never quite explain why. We will follow him there next, out into the torch-lit dark, where the walls of the castle took on their true purpose once the gates finally swung shut for the night. There is a particular sound a castle makes as night falls, the heavy groan of the main gate swinging shut, followed by the deep, unmistakable thud of the bar dropping into place across it. Tom had heard that sound almost every evening of his life, and it never failed to settle something in him, a quiet certainty that, for tonight at least, the world outside those walls had been shut politely away. He was not supposed to wander the walls after dark. Most children weren't. But Edmund, finishing his own final rounds of the stable, sometimes allowed his son to walk with him partway along the inner wall walk, where torches burned at intervals and the night watch moved slowly along their rounds, cloaks drawn close against the cold. From up here, the castle looked entirely different than it did by day. The bailey below had become a scattering of soft, glowing windows, the kitchen's banked hearth still throwing a faint orange light, a scattering of candles marking rooms where servants settled in for the evening, the deeper glow of torches near the gate, where 2 guards stood, stamping their feet gently against the cold, and speaking in low, unhurried voices. Beyond the walls, the world had gone almost entirely dark. Somewhere out there, hidden now beneath the night, lay the fields and the river and the scattered cottages of the village that supported the castle and depended on it in turn. On a clear night, if the moon was generous, Tom could sometimes make out the pale shape of the river catching its light, winding away into hills he had never once had reason to cross. It's worth pausing here, gently, on something easy to overlook. We often imagine castles primarily as places built to withstand attack, and this one, like most, had been built with exactly that in mind. Its walls thick, its gate reinforced, its position on the hill chosen for the clear view it offered in every direction. But for the vast majority of the people living inside it, across the vast majority of nights in its long history, that purpose remained quietly theoretical. Most families who lived their whole lives within castle walls never once witnessed a siege. What the walls offered them, night after ordinary night, was something far simpler, and in its own way, far more valuable: the plain, steady feeling of being safe enough to sleep. Still, the watch was never treated carelessly. Even on the quietest nights, guards moved the walls in slow, deliberate rounds, checking the gate, checking the smaller postern door on the castle's far side, occasionally exchanging a low word with each other, simply to stay alert against the pull of boredom and cold. Edmund knew several of them, by name men he'd shoed horses for, or shared a cup of ale with on some past feast day, and they exchanged quiet nods as father and son passed along the walk. "Cold tonight," one of the guards murmured, more observation than complaint. "Colder tomorrow, if the sky holds like this," Edmund answered, glancing upward at a scattering of hard, clear stars. Tom liked these small exchanges more than he could easily explain. There was something comforting in the ordinary rhythm of adults simply talking about the weather, the same way they might on any evening, in any place, safe or otherwise. It made the darkness beyond the walls feel a little less vast. They did not stay out long. The cold eventually won out over curiosity, and Edmund guided his son back down toward the warmth of their small chamber, where a low fire had been kept burning, and Alice was already settling Eileen, half asleep again, beneath the heavy wool blanket. The family's room, like most rooms in the castle, was small and shared and far from luxurious by any modern measure. But in the last hour before sleep, it held everything that mattered. A fire, banked low but steady. 4 people, together, the distant, muffled sound of the night watch's slow footsteps somewhere above. A sound so familiar, it had long since stopped registering as anything but comfort. Aileen settled beside the fire with a bit of mending in her lap, more from habit than any real need to finish it that night. Edmund eased himself down nearby, his back against the cool stone wall, watching the low flames with the particular stillness of a man who has been on his feet since before dawn. Tom lay down on his own straw mattress, listening to the soft murmur of his parents' voices. Nothing urgent, nothing important, just the quiet, familiar sound of two people simply sharing the end of a day. Outside, somewhere beyond the thick stone walls, the wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the first hint of the frost that would settle over the whole valley by morning. But inside, in this one small room, the fire held its steady glow, and one by one, the family drifted towards sleep safe, warm, and entirely unaware of how remarkable, in its own quiet way, this ordinary night truly was. The last log settles in the hearth, sending a handful of sparks upward into the dark. Somewhere above, a guard's slow footsteps continue their rounds along the wall. And in this small stone room, the family sleeps, gathered close against the cold, exactly as families like theirs had done in this castle for generations before them, and would, for a while yet, continue to do. Morning came again the way it always did, the bell, the cold stone floor, Edmund already dressed and moving quietly in the gray half-light. But this morning carried something different in the air, and Tom noticed it before he could name it. A kind of hum beneath the ordinary sounds of the castle waking. More footsteps than usual. A voice near the gate, unfamiliar, calling something to the guards. "Someone's come in the night," Edmund said, answering the question before Tom had fully asked it. Merchant, most likely, waiting on the gate to open properly. Elin, still half tangled in the wool blanket, sat up at the word merchant the way she never quite managed to for the word chores. Elis, already pulling her apron over her head, allowed herself a small smile at her daughter's sudden enthusiasm. Eat first. He'll still be there after. Traveling merchants were not an everyday occurrence, but they were not rare, either perhaps once every week or two, sometimes more often in the warmer months when the roads were kinder. They brought things the castle could not easily produce for itself: salt, dried fish, fine cloth, spices carried across distances that would have seemed almost unimaginable to most people living quietly inside these walls. Their arrival always sent a small ripple of excitement through the household, servants and children alike finding some excuse to pass near the Bailey gate. But before any of that, the castle's other trades needed tending. And this morning, Tom found himself sent not to the stable, but to the smithy itself, where Edmund had a full morning of work ahead and, for once, wanted an extra pair of hands. The forge sat in its own low stone building near the outer wall, chosen deliberately apart from the more flammable thatch and timber structures elsewhere in the bailey. Even from the doorway, the heat reached out to meet them, a deep, steady warmth entirely unlike the flickering comfort of the hall's hearth. Inside, the forge fire glowed a fierce orange-white, tended by bellows that Edmund worked with the easy rhythm of 2 decades' practice. A castle needed a smith the way it needed a cook, though its work was less visible, tucked away from the hall and the kitchens where most daily life unfolded. Horses needed shoeing, always. Tools broke and needed mending hinges, latches, the iron fittings that held doors and shutters and carts together. Even weapons, on the rare occasions they required real attention, passed through hands like Edmund's, though most of his days were spent on far humbler work than swords. This morning it was a wagon wheel's iron rim, badly bent, brought in by one of the castle's carters with an apologetic shrug. Edmund examined it briefly, muttered something about careless driving, and set to work heating the metal until it glowed soft and workable. Tom's job was simple: pump the bellows steadily, hand his father tools as needed, stay well clear of sparks, but he found, as he often did in the smithy, a particular satisfaction in watching stubborn iron slowly yield to patient heat and his father's steady hammer. It's easy to overlook, amid a castle's grander stonework, just how much of its daily function depended on trades like this one small, practical skills passed down through years of quiet apprenticeship. Each craftsman, a kind of living toolkit the household simply could not do without. A castle without a smith would grind slowly to a halt within weeks. A castle without a baker, sooner still. The rhythmic clang of hammer on iron rang out steadily through the morning, a sound so constant within the castle walls that most people, Tom included, had long since stopped truly hearing it the way one stops hearing a river after living beside it long enough. It was simply part of the castle's voice, along with the lowing of cattle in the outer yard, the creak of the well's rope, the distant, cheerful shouts of children too young yet for real work, chasing each other between buildings with the particular energy that only cold mornings seemed to produce. By mid-morning, word had spread properly through the household. The merchant at the gate had, indeed, been allowed in, and his cart was being unloaded near the storehouses close to the kitchen. Edmund, seeing his son's poorly hidden restlessness, finally relented with a small, tired laugh. "Go on, then, but mind your back before the bell." Tom didn't need telling twice. By the time Tom reached the storehouses, a small crowd had already gathered, servants finding reasons to linger, a pair of kitchen boys pretending to be busy while clearly doing nothing of the sort, and Elin, who had somehow arrived before him, standing at the very front with the fearless confidence only a 7-year-old could manage. The merchant himself was a weathered, cheerful man named Osric, his cart heavy with goods gathered from towns Tom had only ever heard named in passing. Bundles of dried fish, wrapped tight against the damp, sacks of salt, precious enough that the castle's steward personally oversaw their weighing. Small clay jars sealed with wax, holding spices whose smell alone sharp, warm, faintly sweet was enough to draw curious noses from several yards away, and tucked carefully near the back of the cart, several bolts of dyed cloth in colors far richer than anything Tom's own family owned. The steward, a lean, careful man named Master Wilfred, moved along the cart with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had haggled over goods for most of his working life. He examined the salt closely, tasted a pinch from one sack, frowned slightly at the price Osric named, and began the long, familiar dance of negotiation that would eventually settle somewhere agreeable to both men. This, too, was simply part of how a castle survived. For all its walls and self-sufficiency, no household of this size could produce everything it needed within its own boundaries. Salt for preserving meat through the winter. Spices to make plain food interesting on feast days. Fine cloth for the Lord's household, since even great families understood the quiet importance of appearing, on the right occasions, exactly as grand as their position demanded. A steady trickle of merchants like Osric kept the castle connected to a much wider world beyond its own hill, one it depended on more than its thick stone walls might suggest at first glance. Elin, meanwhile, had found something far more interesting than salt. A small wooden box near the front of the cart, holding a scattering of polished glass beads, deep blue and green, catching what little morning light reached them. Osric, noticing her interest with the easy warmth of a man well used to charming children into asking their parents for things, held one up between two fingers. "A fine eye you have, little one," he said, grinning. "These traveled further than you'd believe to sit in that box." Elin's eyes went wide, already halfway to formulating an argument for why she absolutely required one. Tom, older and slightly wiser in the ways of their family's modest means, gently steered her attention elsewhere before hope curdled into disappointment. It wasn't only goods that Osric carried, either. Merchants moved between towns and castles alike, and with them moved news awaiting 2 valleys over, a poor harvest reported further south, a bridge washed out somewhere along the very road he'd just traveled. In a world without any faster way for information to move, a man like Osric was as valuable for what he'd heard as for what he carried in his cart. Servants lingered a little longer than strictly necessary, half listening for anything worth repeating later over the evening meal. By early afternoon, the negotiations had settled. Goods had been carried into the storehouses, and Osric's now much lighter cart creaked back through the gate, bound for whatever village or castle lay next along his route. The little burst of excitement he'd brought with him began, gradually, to fade back into the castle's usual rhythm, Master Wilfred returning to his ledgers, the kitchen boys reluctantly remembering their actual duties, Ellen still faintly mourning the blue glass bead she had not, in the end, been permitted to have. Tom found her later that afternoon, sitting near the garden wall, unusually quiet, turning a plain gray pebble over in her fingers, as though trying to convince herself it was nearly as good. "It wasn't that special," he offered, sitting down beside her. "It was blue," Ellen said, with the particular gravity of someone who considers the matter entirely settled. Tom laughed, and after a moment, so did she, and whatever small disappointment had been sitting on her shoulders eased, the way such things always seemed to by the time supper arrived, and the whole family gathered once more near the hall's steady fire. Outside, the last of Osric's cart tracks are already fading from the frost-softened path leading away from the gate. Inside, a fire is being built up again for the evening, its first small flames catching and rising, warm and golden against the gathering dusk. The days grew shorter with a quiet insistence that Tom had come to recognize as clearly as any calendar. Frost lingered longer each morning on the cobbles of the bailey. The garden near the chapel wall, so full of green only weeks before, had been mostly stripped bare, its last hardy vegetables pulled and carried down to the cellars, and the whole castle, in ways large and small, had shifted its attention toward a single quiet task that would occupy it for weeks to come, making certain there would be enough to see everyone through the winter ahead. Elise felt this shift most of all. The kitchen's rhythm changed with the season, less about the day's single meal and more about preservation, about turning a harvest's brief abundance into something that could last through months when nothing fresh would grow. Barrels of salted meat lined the cool stone cellars. Strings of onions and garlic hung drying from the rafters, alongside bundles of herbs. Apples, wrapped carefully in straw, were laid in rows where the cold would keep them edible far longer than anyone might expect. It was careful, patient work, and it left little room for waste. A poor season, a badly stored barrel of grain gone damp with mold, a summer's harvest smaller than hoped. Any of these could mean a harder winter for everyone inside the walls, from the Lord's own table down to the kitchen boys who slept nearest the ovens. This was, in fact, the quiet worry Elise had been carrying these past weeks, one she hadn't yet spoken aloud even to Edmund. The autumn grain harvest, gathered from the fields beyond the castle that belonged to the Lord's estate, had come in noticeably thinner than the year before a wet summer had seen to that, rot creeping into more of the standing crop than anyone liked to admit. She had overheard Master Wilfred discussing it quietly with the head cook, voices low enough to suggest they didn't want the concern spreading through the household before it needed to. She said nothing of it to the children. There was little to be gained in placing a grown worry onto small shoulders, and besides, nothing had gone wrong, yet only the possibility of it, turning over quietly in the back of her mind while her hands stayed busy with more immediate tasks. It was Edmund who finally noticed, one evening, the particular stillness she'd carried through supper. "You've had something on you for days," he said simply, once the children had drifted towards sleep and the two of them sat near the low fire, the room settling into its familiar evening quiet. Elise considered denying it, then didn't. She told him what she'd overheard the thin harvest, the careful arithmetic Master Wilfred had been quietly running through the storehouse ledgers, the worry, unspoken but present, that stores might need stretching further than usual before spring finally arrived. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire. "It's not the first lean year this castle's seen," he said eventually, "nor likely the last. Wilfred's careful. He'll see the stores stretched fair before he lets anyone go truly hungry servants, same as Lord's table, near enough. That's always been his way. It wasn't a solution, exactly. Edmund could no more control the size of a harvest than he could control the weather that shaped it. But there was something steadying in his certainty, all the same, not blind optimism, but the plain, practical confidence of a man who had weathered lean years before and understood, deeply that a well-run household found ways through them. This, too, is worth sitting with gently. Life inside a castle was not without its real anxieties, the kind that had little to do with sieges or battles, and everything to do with the same worries that shaped almost every household in this period. High-born or low, would the harvest hold? Would the winter be mild or cruel? Would there be enough? These were the quiet concerns that occupied far more of people's daily thoughts than any distant threat of war. And they were carried, very often, not by lords in their halls, but by the Alices and Wilfrids of the world, the ones whose careful daily arithmetic determined whether an entire household made it comfortably to spring. Alice let out a slow breath, some small portion of the weight easing from her shoulders, simply for having spoken it aloud. "You're likely right," she said, though the words carried more hope than certainty. Edmund reached over and, in the quiet way of a man not given to grand gestures, took her hand for a moment. "Get some sleep. Worrying won't grow more grain." She managed a small, tired laugh at that, and let it be enough for one evening. Whatever quiet uncertainty hung over the castle stores, it did not stop the household from preparing for one of the last true celebrations before winter properly closed in a harvest feast, held each year around this time, more modest than the grand feasts of high summer, but no less anticipated by those who'd spent the past weeks buried in preservation work. The morning of the feast, the kitchen moved with an energy Tom hadn't seen in weeks. Extra hands had been brought in to help women from the village below the castle, arriving early through the gate with baskets balanced on their hips, greeted warmly by Alice and the other cooks as old, familiar faces. The two great hearths blazed higher than usual, and the smell that filled the covered walkway by mid-morning was almost dizzying in its richness, roasting meat, fresh bread, something sweet simmering slowly that Elin kept trying, unsuccessfully, to identify by smell alone. Even the hall itself had been transformed in its own understated way. Fresh rushes had been laid across the stone floor, mixed with sweet-smelling herbs that released their scent underfoot. The long tables had been scrubbed clean, and along the walls a scattering of extra candles waited to be lit once dusk properly settled in. A feast like this was not, strictly, a break from the castle's rhythm so much as a brief, deliberate loosening of it, a shared acknowledgement that the harvest, thin as it might have been this year, had still been gathered, still stood between the household and the winter ahead, and deserved in its own modest way to be honored. By evening, the hall filled properly. Benches crowded shoulder to shoulder with servants, craftsmen, kitchen staff, and their families, the lord and his household seated, as always, along the raised table at the far end, though even that distance seemed to soften somewhat under the general warmth of the occasion. Firelight caught on faces flushed from both heat and the small allowance of extra ale poured for the evening. Somewhere near the hearth, a servant with a talent for it had brought out a simple pipe, And though the music was modest, it was enough to draw a handful of the younger servants into something resembling dancing, clumsy and joyful in equal measure. Elin, full of roasted meat and the sweet honeyed something she'd finally identified as spiced stewed apples, had found her way once again to the dogs by the fire, though tonight she had considerably more competition for their attention from a dozen other scrap hopeful children scattered nearby. Tom sat a little apart with a few boys near his own age, half listening to their chatter, half simply watching the hall's warm chaos with the particular contentment of someone who has eaten well and has nowhere else he'd rather be. Edmund and Alice sat together near one of the long tables, her earlier worry, for tonight at least, set quietly aside. It would return likely in the coming weeks, as it did most years around this time, but tonight there was warmth, and food, and the simple, steady comfort of a household gathered together, safe within its walls as the first true chill of winter waited patiently beyond them. As the evening wore on, and the youngest children, Elin among them, began finally succumbing to the pull of a full stomach and a warm fire, the feast gently wound toward its close. Candles burned lower, conversations softened. One by one, families rose from the long benches and made their way back toward their own small corners of the castle, carrying with them the particular quiet satisfaction that only a shared meal, freely given, seems able to produce. The last musician sets down his pipe. Somewhere near the hearth, a child sleeps against a dog's warm side, undisturbed by the gentle bustle of servants beginning to clear the tables. Outside, the first true frost of the season is settling silently across the bailey, and within the walls, the castle exhales gently into the coming winter. By the time the castle reached the heart of winter, the world beyond its walls had gone almost entirely white. Snow lay thick across the bailey each morning, softening the harsh lines of stone into something gentler, and the river below the hill had slowed to a sluggish crawl along its edges, thin ice creeping outward from the banks. Inside the walls, life had drawn inward 2 shorter days, longer evenings by the fire, the whole household adjusting itself to the particular patience winter always demanded. And yet, amid the cold, there was warmth to look forward to. Christmas was approaching, and even in a household governed largely by careful rationing and quiet routine, the season carried with it a kind of held breath, an anticipation that touched everyone from the Lord's own family down to the youngest kitchen boy. Elin had taken to asking, almost daily, how many more sleeps remained, a question Alice answered with steadily decreasing patience and steadily growing fondness. The castle's chapel had begun preparing for the season's observances, candles set aside in greater number than usual, and even the kitchen, careful as it had been with its stores since autumn, allowed itself certain small extravagances, a bit more spice saved back, a portion of dried fruit set aside specifically for the days ahead. For a household like theirs, Christmas was not a single day so much as a stretch of days, beginning with proper church observance and unfolding gradually into a rare, welcome loosening of the usual rhythm. Ordinary work didn't vanish entirely. Animals still needed tending. Fires still needed feeding, but its edges softened. There was more time by the hearth, more patience for a child's chatter, more willingness, even from Master Wilfred, to allow a little extra warmth into a season that could otherwise feel long and gray. On the day itself, the whole household gathered for a longer service than usual in the chapel. The small room filled nearly to its limits with servants and their families, breath visible in the cold air despite the candles' gathered warmth. Afterward, the hall opened into something closer to true celebration than the modest harvest feast had been. A larger meal, a fire built higher than usual, and, for one evening, a gentle blurring of the careful distances that ordinarily separated Lord's table from servant's bench. Tom remembered every year how the hall looked on this particular evening, candlelight multiplied across dozens of small flames, holly and evergreen boughs brought in to soften the gray stone walls, the whole room somehow both grander and warmer than it managed to feel on any ordinary day. Elin, predictably, was radiant with the particular joy of a child for whom an extra sweet pastry and a later bedtime constituted something close to true magic. Even Alice, whose shoulders had carried a quiet weight since autumn, allowed herself to set it down for these few days. The harvest had been thin, yes, but not so thin as to threaten true hardship, not with careful management and a household accustomed to weathering exactly this kind of lean season. Master Wilfred's careful arithmetic, it seemed, had held. It's worth noting, gently, that midwinter celebrations like this one served a purpose beyond simple enjoyment, real as that enjoyment was. In a season defined largely by cold, darkness, and careful endurance, a shared celebration offered something a household genuinely needed, a reminder, held in common, that warmth and light and togetherness still existed, even at the year's darkest point. It cost the castle something in stores it could ill entirely spare. But it returned something less easily measured, and perhaps just as necessary. As the evening wound down, Edmund carried a half-asleep Elin back toward their small chamber, her cheek pressed against his shoulder, one hand still loosely closed around a small carved wooden toy Master Wilfred had, in an uncharacteristic moment of season-softened generosity, allowed the kitchen staff to distribute among the household's children. Tom walked alongside his mother, unusually quiet, simply tired in the particular warm, contented way that follows a good evening among people you love. Behind them, the hall's candles were slowly being extinguished, one by one, until only the great hearth's steady glow remained, casting long shadows across rushes strewn thick with holly and the last quiet murmur of servants finishing their own evening's work. The weeks following Christmas settled into winter's true, unhurried pace, the shortest days of the year giving way, with agonizing slowness, to afternoons that stretched, almost imperceptibly, a few minutes longer each week. It was, in many ways, the hardest stretch of the whole year to endure, not because of any single dramatic hardship, but simply because of how long it demanded patience be sustained. It was during these deep winter weeks that a mild fever moved quietly through parts of the household, as such things often did when a large number of people spent so much time crowded close together against the cold. Elin caught it first, a few days of flushed cheeks and unusual quiet that worried Ailís more than she let show. Though the household's own healer, an older woman named Mother Ines, well-versed in the herbs and remedies passed down through generations of careful practice, assessed her calmly and pronounced it nothing more than a passing chill, common enough this time of year, needing rest, warmth, and a tea brewed from herbs kept dried in the kitchen's rafters for exactly this purpose. Allie sat with her daughter through the worst of it, spooning warm broth between sips of Mother Inese's tea, humming softly the same wordless tune her own mother had once hummed to her. Tom, banished gently from the sick room lest he catch the same chill, spent those days finding quiet ways to be useful elsewhere, though he checked in at the doorway often enough that Ailís eventually stopped trying to shoo him away entirely. Within a week, Aelin's fever had broken, and her usual restless energy had returned in full, much to the relief of everyone who'd grown unaccustomed to the quiet. It was, in the end, exactly the kind of small, ordinary illness that moved through households constantly in this period uncomfortable, worrying in the moment, but rarely, in a household with reasonable food and careful tending, anything more than that. It's worth remembering, gently, that daily life in this period carried a kind of steady, practical resilience around illness that can be easy to overlook from a distance. People did not face sickness with the tools we have now, but neither did they face it without knowledge or care. Herb lore, careful nursing, simple remedies passed down through generations of women like Mother Ines Olivet formed a quiet, competent web of care that saw most ordinary illnesses through to ordinary recoveries, season after season, much as it had for Elin. With the worst of winter's illness behind them, the household settled back into its familiar rhythm, waiting, as it did every year, for the small, accumulating signs that spring was finally, truly approaching. A slight softening in the frost each morning, birdsong returning, tentative at first, to the bare trees beyond the walls. The days growing visibly longer, until even Elin's daily count of remaining winter felt less like a countdown and more like a comfortable, familiar wait for something certain to arrive. Edmund's work picked up as the ground began, faintly, to thaw more horses needing attention as travel resumed, more repairs needed after winter's wear on carts and tools. Ailís's kitchen shifted its focus once more, stores carefully tracked and stretched exactly as far as they needed to, precisely as Edmund had promised months before they would be. The castle, in its steady, patient way, had weathered another lean winter, exactly as it had weathered every winter before it, through nothing more dramatic than careful work, quiet endurance, and the accumulated wisdom of generations who had done the very same thing. On one of the first true mild evenings, the family gathered again near their small hearth. The fire built lower, now that the deepest cold had finally loosened its grip. Elin, fully recovered and characteristically restless, was already chattering about the garden, soon to be replanted, about whether Osric might return before summer with more of his glass beads, about a dozen small hopes only a child recovering from a long winter could hold with such uncomplicated joy. Alice watched her, some final trace of autumn's worry easing fully from her shoulders at last. Edmund reached over and, in his quiet way, took her hand again, the same gesture he'd offered months before beside this same low fire. "Told you," he said simply. "We always find our way through." The fire settles low and steady in the hearth. Outside, the first true breath of a coming spring stirs faintly through the bailey, carrying with it the promise, however distant still, of green returning to the hills beyond the castle walls. Inside, the family sits together in the quiet, golden light, exactly as they have through every season this past year, tired, ordinary, and entirely, unremarkably content. We have spent a long while now inside these walls. We have watched Edmund shape iron with patient hands, and Ailey's turn a thin harvest into a winter no one truly went without. We have followed Tom along a torch-lit wall walk and sat beside Elin as she mourned a small blue bead and, just as quickly, forgot to. None of them left their names in any grand record. No plaque marks the room where they slept. No chronicle remembers the wagon wheel Edmund mended that autumn morning, or the tea Mother Ines brewed to bring a small girl's fever down. And yet, for one full turning of the seasons, we have lived quietly beside them through frost and feast, worry and relief, the ordinary weight of a hard winter, and the ordinary joy of finding your way through it together. That, perhaps, is the truest thing a castle like this can teach us. We are so often drawn to the parts of history that shout the sieges, the crowned heads, the battles fought beneath painted banners. But most of history was never lived at that volume. Most of it sounded like this instead: a bellows working steadily in a warm forge, a spoon scraping the last of a pottage from an iron pot, a child's laughter chasing a dog across cold stone, a low fire settling into embers while a family, tired and together, drifts toward sleep. The castle itself still stands, in one form or another, on hills like the one we imagined at the start of this evening. Its stones have seen centuries pass since Edmund's forge went cold for the last time, since Elin grew, married, perhaps raised children of her own within walls not so different from these. The details of their particular lives have faded, the way most details eventually do, but the shape of what they lived, the rhythm of a household, finding its way through one more winter, one more year, one more ordinary, unremarkable, deeply human stretch of time that shape remains, echoed in countless homes, in countless winters, long before them and long after. The fire in the hearth burns low now, embers glowing soft amid gathering ash. Outside, snow continues to settle quietly across the hills surrounding the castle, softening every hard edge of stone and wall alike. Somewhere beyond those hills, in some other home entirely, Another family is likely doing exactly what this one has done tonight, banking a fire, checking on a sleeping child, taking a tired hand in the quiet dark and finding, in that small gesture, enough reassurance to close their eyes. Perhaps, after all these centuries, we are not so different from them. Rest well.